Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Apple Lecture 2024, an evening with Ross Perlin. I'm very excited to see you all here on behalf of the Applied Linguistics and TESOL program. We're very excited that you're here with us tonight. I would just like to take this opportunity to remind you to please silence any of your mobile devices for the duration of the lecture. And also at the end of the lecture and after the Q&A, we will have a hosted reception. There's food, there's a wine bar, and you'll be directed to that venue by somebody standing in the hallway with a sign, in case you're not familiar with our slightly labyrinthian campus. So with that said, I'm going to hand you off to our program director, Vivian Lindhartson.
Thank you. I know that Cicely has already welcomed you, but I will do that as well. Welcome everyone here on behalf of the AL and TESOL program. Also, welcome to those of you who are online. Welcome to our Apple lecture. We call this event Apple, not just because we are in the Big Apple, but also because it is an acronym for Applied Linguistics and Language Education. We owe our Apple lecture series to LINC, Language Innovations Incorporated, who gave Teachers College the endowment that has made it possible for us to run this series. LINC was a group of talented ESL teachers who published books and ESL teaching materials and organized engaging workshops in the 70s and 80s with some really cool clothes, I bet. We also have to thank Dr. Leslie Beebe, who came up with the idea of spending the money on a lecture series. She was the director of our AL and TESOL program, for many years. Our Apple lecture series aims to present cutting-edge research and discuss current topics in our field. And this evening's talk by Dr. Ross Perlin from across the street is particularly interesting. The talk is titled Language City, the Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York. The topic is indeed current, and it aligns very well with the mission of TC and of our program. But before we start, I'd like to thank a few people. First and foremost, Cicely Rood and her army of volunteers, along with Kiana Howerton, and they all work tirelessly behind the scenes to make this happen. Thank you also to Sean, Ashley, Mariah, and Kelly, who behalf on our web journal, SALT, interviewed our Apple speaker. I hope they didn't wear you out too much. Finally, thank you to Dr. Vafe and Dr. Williams for supervising this event. And now I'll hand it over to Dr. Howard Williams to introduce our speaker.
Hey, everybody. So I hope everybody can hear me. When I read Ross Perlin's book, Language City, I think everybody here probably has seen it. The first thing that comes to mind is a film that was made back around 2008 called The Linguist. I'm sure many of you have seen it or heard of it. It follows the trail of a couple of linguists, David Harrison of Swarthmore and Greg Anderson of the University of Oregon, who travel to various far-flung parts of the globe to document languages in serious danger of extinction for reasons too varied and complicated to talk about here. They go to Siberia to locate speakers of Chulim, who take some time warming to these two guys, but then eventually they welcome them with tears in their eyes. They go to the mountains of Bolivia to learn about the Kalawaya language from a medicine man. They go to elementary schools in eastern India where small kids are learning Hindi and English, which are the two official languages, but not learning the languages of their own home villages. They sometimes, the linguists sometimes put themselves into danger. Initially, at least, being strangers in places where strangers are not very common. But when they leave, one gets the impression that they've left as friends. The two linguists were genuinely interested or primarily interested in documenting languages that might disappear in the next 50 years or so on the home turf of their speakers. They came to the task with the spirit of botanists trying to document rare plants before the plants tragically disappear. But they were also interested in language preservation. In other words, the struggle to keep minoritized languages alive. This too is Ross Perlin's goal. He'll tell you more about it. The main logistical difference between him and Harrison and Anderson is that they traveled across the globe in search of endangered languages, and they managed to concentrate on just a few of them. Ross Perlin has, for the most part, stayed right here in New York City, where many more languages are, in a sense, on his doorstep and on the doorstep of those people that he works with, and also on our own doorstep. And for that, I should say we're lucky. It's an old story that applies to music and art and food and many other things. Sooner or later, everybody comes to New York. I'd like to introduce Ross Perlin.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming, everyone online as well. Thank you, Howard, Kelly, Cicely, Payman, everyone from the Journal, for such a warm welcome. I'm really happy to be here at Teachers College, at this completely unique institution, to be talking to the Applied Linguistics and TESOL program and everyone else as well. And you know, just to have a conversation here that I hope we'll have a lot of time for Q&A afterwards. We'll also have the reception to sort of talk more casually, but to me, this is a great opportunity to sort of bridge. Not only, I also teach over at Columbia as well as working at the Endangered Language Alliance, which I'll talk about, a nonprofit here in New York. But it's an opportunity, I think, to sort of talk between the world of language documentation and endangered language work, which I'm going to talk about tonight, with the work that all of you guys are doing in language teaching, pedagogy, community language work, applied linguistics, their second language acquisition, right? There's so many, I think, fruitful and interesting connections here that I hope we can get into. So to sort of start from where we're sitting in the most linguistically diverse city, not just in the world, but in the history of the world. This is what we've been sort of substantiating and working on over the last decade or so at the Endangered Language Alliance, and which I talk about in my book, Language City, which is sort of the full story, and which a lot of this will be based on. What I want to talk about tonight is the past, present, and future of the world's most linguistically diverse city. How did this come to be? What does that mean? What does that look like? What are the implications for us involved in linguistics? What can we do with this gift, as Howard said, this opportunity, this moment? Languages and their speakers have come here for a range of historical reasons, which we'll talk about, but in some sense, we stand to potentially be a kind of a last-minute outpost, a last-minute haven, a Babel in reverse, as it's been called, where speakers come here, the opportunity is here, but what are we doing to grapple with it, understand it, value it, document the languages that are here, create a kind of linguistic infrastructure, as I call it, for the city? All too often, we haven't done that, and the city has been a kind of sieve. All cities, because we're going to be talking about New York, but I think more broadly, the book and what I want to talk about tonight is about languages in cities more generally, the nature of urban linguistic diversity, deep urban linguistic diversity, especially as it applies to endangered, indigenous, primarily oral and minoritized languages in cities, which have all too often been invisible and are indeed completely invisible in terms of any official data sources, the census, and so on, as I'll talk about. But first, and maybe some of this will be familiar already, but I want to sort of set the table by talking about global linguistic diversity more broadly as it then kind of comes to the city and what that means. So, you know, to the extent that languages can be enumerated, which is always a question, or individuated, we could talk about this. You know, linguists at this point who are focused on linguistic diversity are talk in terms of 7,000 plus languages and innumerable dialects and other varieties. We could talk about what is a language, what is a dialect. I suspect that that's a familiar conversation for many in this room. Linguistic definitions, political definitions, community-oriented definitions. And in terms of enumeration has its problems, data has its problems, but you know, the Ethnologue stands as one of the databases that people now look to, and lists as of its most recent iteration, I think 7,168 languages. If you look at Glottolog, which is the main sort of competitor, which I think also has its virtues and tries to sidestep some of these issues by talking in terms of languoids, right? I think as a way of trying to deal with this trouble of these words, which after all are English words, language and dialect, which of course exist in a few other languages as well, and reflect language originally a Latin word, dialect originally sort of a Greek word in their origins that got sort of entangled sometime in the Renaissance or after the Renaissance. And you know, these terms are of course very different in different languages, right? And are talked about in very different ways. So we need to recognize that when we're talking in terms of language and dialect, we're talking about a particular kind of framework in any case. However you look at it, linguistic diversity goes much deeper than most people think. And I think 7,000 plus languages is a good way just to kind of make people think that, you know, the nation state map of the world, which contains the approximately 200 nations whose borders have mostly been determined by empires and colonialism in the past couple of centuries, you know, compared to the world map of 7,000 plus languages, how do those two things kind of correspond to each other? Most of what we're talking about in terms of linguistic history reflects processes going back millennia, to which we can give no sort of exact firm date, right? What does it mean to say that a language was, you know, born on a particular date at a particular time, how old it is? Of course, many will say, oh, this language is very old or this language is new, but only in a few cases is there some kind of singular event that allows for any kind of consensus or account of a language being born at a particular moment. For the most part, we're talking about deep continuous processes which have been, you know, unfolding for generations. And we can talk about linguistic diversity in many terms. Numerical terms are useful in a society that operates on numerical terms in many cases, but we can also talk in terms of what is sometimes called genealogical diversity or genetic diversity in terms of language families, right? The number of language families has been placed at something close to 500, between 400 and 500. Of course, a language family represents sort of descent from a putative proto-language as determined by historical linguistics, often many sort of controversies and questions about how you do that. Some language families like Indo-European or Austronesian are relatively kind of, well established or clearly sort of argued, while controversy rages over the names of other language families and how exactly they're going to be construed, like the battles over, Sino-Tibetan versus Tibeto-Burman versus Trans-Himalayan. And some of that is nomenclature, but in any case, we're talking about hundreds of distinct language families with many different subgroups. And then we can also talk in terms of, and this should say diversity in numerical terms, as well as families and features. So a third type of diversity to talk about is featural or structural or typological diversity, right? The underlying deep features of languages, whether we're talking about constituent order, subject, object, verb versus verb initial languages versus, object initial languages and so on, across any number of features, and databases like the World Atlas of Linguistic Structures, the WALS database, kind of reflect just how deeply diverse the structures of the world can be, the structures of the world's languages. And so, again, it's all just to sort of suggest this kind of global picture of linguistic diversity, which goes far beyond what I think most of us kind of are taught or kind of understand initially. And then the fact that the vast majority of these languages are traditionally oral, primarily oral, have no support from any level of government in any of those 200 nation states or so, and are generally unstandardized, have not been through the processes of standardization and scriptification that we kind of are familiar with from the largest languages, and that the kind of monolingualism which is now becoming more common in some of the larger nation states like English in the US is historically rare, that multilingualism has been the historic norm in most of the world, in most communities, which I think has important implications for how we think about these things, and that was occurring without formal education in most cases, and had to do with the particular linguistic ecologies of particular, different parts of the world. At this point, linguists consider half of these 7,000 plus languages to be endangered, and we'll talk about what that means or looks like. And that's precisely the half of all languages which are least documented, of which the least is known. And that really means in many cases, in the case of hundreds and hundreds of languages, we have nothing more than, in some cases, a word list, no dictionary, no grammatical description, no archive of texts. The best libraries in the world, like those that are around us, have collections in a few hundred languages. The internet itself reflects something like 5% of the world's languages. And then, even there, really it's 1% or less than 1% that are well represented. So, when we talk about sort of people speak in terms of under-resourced languages or less resourced languages, I think, we're talking, it's almost sort of unimaginable to the speaker of a larger language who has at their fingertips a vast array of resources in English or Spanish and so on. I think can hardly kind of wrap their head around the fact that there will simply be no texts or no materials in many of the world's languages. And the linguistic diversity we're talking about is not sort of evenly distributed across the face of the planet. It has sort of structures and patterns in how it's distributed in some of the same ways that biodiversity does as well. There are certain kind of what have been called language hotspots, areas of the world that for various reasons have developed and maintained linguistic diversity, which perhaps reflects more of the historic norm, and should not be seen, as some kind of outlier. Actually, the question might be sort of thrown back on the places that are less diverse now. How did that come to be the case? Part of it certainly has to do with terrain and, geography and A lot also has to do with history as well. So certainly mountains and islands and certain kinds of, environments, but also having some distance from empires and nation states and markets, at least until recently. And, isolation is part of the story, but so is traffic and travel. And again, multilingualism, it's not about sort of languages being in completely isolated environments, but it is about having enough in terms of livelihood and in terms of a geographic kind of space to develop a distinctive set of life ways and speech ways. And linguistic diversity can't be seen separately, I think, from biodiversity, cultural diversity, and this sort of suite of situations. So this might be hard to see, but this is just giving a sense from one of these databases of languages that's sort of coded by endangerment level, just to see that there's a distribution perhaps around the equator, there's a distribution in certain mountain ranges, there are particular distributions and sort of these linguistic diversity hotspots around the world. These, of course, what does it mean to map a language is something that we'll also kind of talk about. The idea that you can sort of put a dot on a map in the sort of homeland of a language is something that is quite a simplification and reflects a real set of choices, but nonetheless, maps like numbers are something that kind of inspire us and give us visuals that can make these complexities kind of manageable. So I think language mapping will also be something we'll talk about tonight that's useful. As for what is endangerment? What do we mean by endangerment? There are many terms we could be using here, but the movement to talk about endangered languages modeled after the discussions in the world of biodiversity among biologists and others talking about endangered species. And it's a very imperfect correlation. Languages are not species, languages are not individuals. That's, we can talk about that. It's really a metaphorical connection. But there is now a whole kind of set of procedures for talking about language endangerment and thinking about what it means. And it doesn't just come down to speaker numbers, although speaker numbers are an important factor, and approximately half of the world's languages have fewer than 10,000 speakers, and many languages have a single speaker or a few speakers. And we might ask at that point, what does it mean for the language to is it still spoken? In what ways is it still used if there are one or a few speakers? But the defining factor really is considered to be intergenerational transmission. And this, I think, is perhaps an overly kind of technical way of thinking about it, but this is the so-called EGIDS, expanded generational kind of schema that looks at, based originally on the work of Joshua Fishman and then adapted by, the system as Ethnologue uses it, and others have used this system. There's a few others, but again, just in terms of like, for those databases and those needs to sort of classify these things, talk in terms of a whole kind of spectrum of endangerment, going from, in this case, 0 means it's an international language, it's widely used, it's English, it's Spanish, it's Arabic, all the way to, the terms that were used originally were sort of dormant or extinct at level 10. Talk of extinction and language death is generally kind of best avoided now for various reasons, partly because it draws on these biological metaphors, partly because many speakers and indigenous linguists, scholars have argued that it really it dramatically kind of underestimates the possibilities of language revitalization and all the possible developments that can follow. So terms like sleeping or reawakening are also being used, but essentially we're talking about a variety of situations that are keyed to different levels of intergenerational transmission, where even a single generational break can be very hard to come back from for various reasons. And all the factors that go into intergenerational transmission are sort of essential to think about here. And of course, these processes, can carry on for centuries and generations before that sort of a real break occurs. It's not always such a, such a sharp moment, but really, there are many factors that we can talk about. Certainly domains of use is another in terms of endangerment, sort of shrinking number of domains when a language is usually shrinking down to the level of just the home or the head of a single speaker. These are all kind of different ways of thinking about the issue of endangerment. The nation state map that most languages face today, the world of the sort of largest languages that now account for the vast majority of the world's population. So 4% of the world's population speaking 96% of the world's languages and vice versa. So still a significant number of people, but and of course many, multilingualism has to be kind of accounted for as well. But the march of the larger languages and the impact of not just the speakers of larger languages, but the authorities tasked with promoting larger languages and the processes which have played out over the years and centuries, which we can talk about, but I think are probably evident to all. We're talking about centuries of colonial activity, now of national activity, of certain economic activity that has driven languages that were in relatively stable position. Of course, languages have always come and gone, and there's always been, there have always been reasons why, the languages of the more powerful have moved into certain areas, and then, then there's been an ebb and flow of language kind of differentiation and unification. But in the same ways that biodiversity has now been, also kind of impacted by this, you see the pace of endangerment of languages has accelerated dramatically, really, in the last century or so, with all of these forces sort of coming to a head. And that then those are sort of the macro level processes, but what happens then in terms of language attitudes, the internalization of shame around speaking a smaller language, the spread of mass literacy in the 20th century, and then the sort of impact for those languages which are still kind of on the oral side of that, what becomes a divide, whereas orality had traditionally been, completely adequate for the life ways of most peoples speaking most languages around the world, but suddenly this becomes a major deficit or gap. So, this raises a question which I will only kind of gesture towards because it's a giant topic in and of itself that is an emerging area of study, this question of language justice and how it's also linked to other forms of justice as well, environmental justice, economic justice, and social justice. This is sort of in its infancy in that linguistic rights, although mentioned in certain conventions of the UN and in certain laws, are generally, sort of only honored in the breach or only kind of nascent, the idea that you have a right to mother tongue education or the right to speak a mother tongue. In many places, there has been, outright bans on the use of language, obviously from residential schools in North America to, political movements across the world. There have been various kinds of punishments meted out to those who don't speak a particular language or refuse to speak a particular language. So even just to sort of get past all the coercion that has, there's the level of coercion, and then there's all the sort of subtler levels by which there's the pressure to shift languages. But all of this is sort of the background, even if today people say, well, aren't people choosing to shift languages or choosing not to pass on a language? Those purported choices are being made in circumstances of major historical pressures. And the study of linguistic discrimination or linguicism is something that is only kind of recently, I think, coming into this discussion of endangered languages as well. And still the question of whether, for many, this principle of linguistic equality, as it has been called, the idea that every mother tongue as natively spoken is equally sophisticated in terms of its structures, its ability to communicate all of the cognitive and communicative needs of its speakers, this concept that for linguists is almost sort of second nature is still kind of very poorly diffused, you could say, into the wider world. There's still a sort of linguistic Darwinism, which many espouse, that somehow English must be a more, adaptive language, or any language that is, spoken by a powerful group, it somehow comes to be seen, whether it's that the language is holier or the language is more modern or it's more sophisticated. And this makes no sense linguistically. Sure, you can say that there's a word for iPhone or there's a word for computer, but these words are, can easily be borrowed and moved. And the idea that it's coined in one particular language, I mean, these sort of meta languages from which technical terminology come, every language has sort of needed and benefited from, these sort of, trails of lexicons and words moving through them. But there's really, no sense in which any language is inferior or broken as when it's spoken natively. But I think that still kind of exists, the idea that, if a language is not written, it's somehow or not standardized, it somehow has no grammar or is broken in some way. And then there are many who take a sort of utilitarian point of view, which is that, the most widely spoken languages are the ones that need to be supported. It's about, the greatest good for the greatest number, linguistically speaking. And, what is the point with a language with just a few speakers? And I think, from the point of view of endangered language documentation, or diversity linguistics, as it's also been called, it's actually, it's the logic is flipped. And it's often, from a linguistic point of view, the languages with the smallest number of speakers that have the most to teach us, that have the most extraordinary features in many cases, that have been retained, that have not been through processes of almost sort of creolization and leveling that often affect the more widely spoken languages. And, in terms of other, justifications for the documenting of linguistic diversity, the poetry, the wisdom, the music, the oral literature, the knowledge that is contained in every language is a library and a universe unto itself, even if there are no books in the libraries of universities, or the libraries of the dominant language world. So, there I think are many important scientific and political and cultural and other reasons why we should care. So now I want to kind of now pull into where we are, and talk about New York, talk about how global linguistic diversity is kind of is channeled here, and this very particular kind of reflection of it that exists in New York that I document in Language City. This was and is a Lenape-speaking archipelago. This is an image of a Lenape class at our center on 18th Street of the Endangered Language Alliance, with Karen, whose story is told in the book. She passed away. She's here in the center with glasses on her head, who was the first person to bring Lenape back to this land in several centuries to teach it. And she was coming from Ontario. Ontario, Canada is one of the two places that the Lenape diaspora, two major places that the Lenape diaspora was displaced to across a centuries-long set of processes that have seen remarkably the survival of the language, with what's now considered to be one native speaker in her 80s, named Diane Snake, who lives in Ontario, as well as a group of revivalists from the different reservations, including Karen, who are now learning it as a second language and beginning to teach it and spread it across this far-flung Lenape diaspora, and indeed bring it back to New York as well, or Lenape Hoking. Exactly 400 years ago, you have the foundation of New Amsterdam by the Dutch West India Company. And this is atop the Lenape-speaking archipelago, begins those processes of displacement, and at the same time ushers in a new kind of multilingual entrepot that, even within its first decades, according to the very first Catholic priest to visit, Father Jogues, brought speakers of 18 different languages, as he reported, when there was a population of just 400 to 500 people here. And it's crucial that even kind of at that moment, this place was unlike the other 12 colonies that were essentially English speaking and being founded across the Eastern Seaboard in North America. This was the project of a commercial, although state-backed company, wasn't initially exactly a project of the Netherlands as such, but of the Dutch West India Company. And the population was, it seems, never even majority Dutch at that time, but rather this place that came into being was sort of at the intersection of 3 continents, with the arrival of especially European minority peoples. The very first settlers exactly 400 years ago were Walloon-speaking religious refugees from the border of what's now France and Belgium. This is a minority language of Europe, by many counts endangered. The language is brought by enslaved Africans in the very earliest years from especially what's now Congo and Angola, and Native American languages, including Lenape and several other languages. So already the junction of 3 continents in this very particular kind of historical kind of environment of this new port, which was part of a chain of ports that the Dutch West India Company was kind of creating around the world. We don't know exactly what these languages were. They're not named, they're not mentioned. I've tried to reconstruct it and kind of group it here in terms of Native American languages, African languages, some of the European languages. We don't know what Father Jogues or the Director General that he was quoting would have considered to be a language at that time exactly, or what was meant. But it's clear that a multilingual template was being set in the city from the very outset, and that that minority languages were overrepresented from the very beginning. And I think part of the story that I tell in Language City is that what has happened since is a continuous history, 4 centuries long now, of ever deepening linguistic diversity as, you know, as a sort of an ever widening pool of peoples have come here for a variety of reasons. But the historic role of this place as an immigration gateway was kind of already being set at this time. And this is now a path that cities around the world are taking. But in New York, the processes have been going perhaps longer than anywhere else and most continuously. So this is, you know, a kind of, I'll sort of do a brief history then of what the ensuing 4 centuries bring. You know, today, half of all New Yorkers speak a language other than English at home. And that has been the case for much of the city's history. And, you know, that initially was quite distinctive, but I think has become more and more normal nationally and in other cities as well. And that this has been crucial to the city's development in every sphere and has informed many of its most particular economic, political, and other arrangements. And, you know, crucially, what also begins to happen, I mean, in 1664, the English take over from the Dutch, and actually Dutch persists in sort of extraordinary ways as well. Dutch by this point had become a sort of lingua franca connecting all these diverse peoples. So even though the majority of people were not native Dutch speakers, Dutch was a lingua franca, much as English is a lingua franca today. And then Dutch persists to an extraordinary degree into the 19th century, indeed maybe even into the early 20th century in upstate New York in certain ways. Actually a distinctive Dutch that is then cut off from the Dutch of the Netherlands. And even though the English take over, it doesn't really become English. Just as it was never really Dutch, it doesn't really become English. In some ways, even when the American Revolution happens and independence of the United States in the late 18th century, it doesn't become fully kind of clearly American either. It's always this kind of ambiguous status, which is where the fundamental identity of the city is a multilingual immigrant identity in many respects. And that also kind of speaks to its, you know, sometimes oppositional and extraordinary relationship with the rest of the country, to which it is a sort of gateway that's connected, but also not quite of it, right? More of a sort of a membrane or a point of connection with the rest of the world. So the way I talk about it in the book is in terms of, you know, initially this kind of minority port where minority peoples, especially of Europe through the 18th and 19th centuries, are are overrepresented. When we think of there being a little Spain, it's actually Galician speaking. When we talk about French New Yorkers and French Americans, they're actually Breton speakers from the western part of the country. When we talk about this massive kind of Italian city that emerges here, one of the largest, places of Italian heritage outside of Italy, it's actually heavily with varieties of Sicilian and Southern Italian varieties, not Italian, the national language. And you have the emergence of the first institutionally complete and truly linguistically distinctive ethnic neighborhoods, really, in the United States as well, such as Klein Deutschland, the sort of pan-Germanic city unto itself that emerged in what's now the East Village, the Lower East Side, where even before Germany was had become a country, you had the presence of a whole variety of Germanic languages and newspapers in Schwabian and Plattdeutsch and so on. You have more Irish speakers, Irish at that point already being a heavily endangered language after centuries of the colonial pressure to speak English. You have more Irish speakers in New York at that point than there are now Irish speakers in the world, something like 70,000 plus Irish speakers in New York in the 19th century. You have the first Irish language journal in the world emerging in Brooklyn. You have also then the role of the city as a sort of survivor city, a place where those who have been enslaved and colonized and decimated elsewhere are able to come and seek refuge across the 19th and 20th centuries. And I guess one of the major themes here is to sort of, in terms of the history of immigration and what it means in the city, is that you can't sort of look to the national level or explain migration patterns in terms of a national migration, but actually have to look to the very specific ties between very specific places as seen through the lens of language to understand the migration patterns. So, as many of those early speakers were, Walloon or Flemish or Frisian, many of the most recent are speakers of Fulani and Fujianese. To speak of them as, coming from Senegal or coming from China is true, but it's to miss something more essential and kind of and particular and local about who they are and what they're speaking and what they're bringing. Now, with all of these languages arriving here, the question of language maintenance and language mixing and what actually happens when these languages arrive on these shores is obviously a crucial one. And universal language shift is a fact of the city's history, as in so many cities. And I think this is one reason why many linguists have tended to dismiss cities as important sites of linguistic research, because they're seen as places of loss and places just of mixing and impurity. Fascinating maybe in terms of language contact, fascinating from a certain sociolinguistic point of view, but not places where languages are expected to be maintained or transmitted. And yet there's fascinating questions here as well in terms of how languages can be maintained in cities, but why there have been different rates of language loss. Certainly, patterns of often 2-3 generation language loss have been a constant in the city's history, but there are some countervailing kind of forces and questions there. Since 1965, I think that's the sort of a crucial date in the sort of cyclical histories of immigration that have shaped the city. 1965 is an important marker because this is when, to some extent, the city becomes ever more a kind of microcosm of global linguistic diversity. Never an exact microcosm by any means. Of those sort of 7,000 plus languages in the world, we've mapped the presence of something like 700 plus, so 10% of the world's linguistic diversity. Of course, that includes all the major languages, but also many endangered and primarily oral ones, as we'll talk about. But it's exactly 100 years ago, next month, with the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, that the country closes its doors on the era of Ellis Island, on this kind of major 19th century, early 20th century period of immigration. There's a huge anti-immigrant backlash. If it sounds familiar, it's at that time it was against those from especially Southern and Eastern Europe, but also followed the processes of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the so-called Gentleman's Agreement, which stopped Japanese immigration. But 1924 marks a moment where the world of Ellis Island really is kind of shut down, which had been, Ellis Island is for good reason the sort of defining symbol of a major hemispheric migration, which was happening from, especially at that time, Europe to the Americas, of which New York was the essential and Ellis Island was the essential membrane, but this also deeply shaped societies across the Americas. And it's only in 1965 that the country sort of reopens its doors with the Hart-Celler Immigration Act. And this then leads to, I think, where we are today, the emergence at that point of a Latin American New York, of a Caribbean New York, of an Asian New York, of an African New York. Although in some of the groundwork had been laid, it's after 1965 that you see microcosms really of whole language hotspots from these different parts of the world kind of mapped onto New York City neighborhoods, which is what I'll sort of try to get into now a little bit. So as I said, over 700 languages that we've mapped as being present in New York. Looking numerically, the largest portion from Asia, writ large, the next largest portion from Africa. But more crucially, in terms of the way that the linguistic diversity of the city and the metropolitan area is structured, are these kind of macro communities and microcosms. So 100+ languages of West Africa in Harlem and the Bronx. The whole kind of linguistic world of South Asia and the Himalaya, or much of it in and around Jackson Heights, Queens. The world of Soviet linguistic diversity, in a now post-Soviet vein in and around Brighton Beach in Brooklyn. And then, the way that what I think are the language mapping that we've been doing and that I kind of get into in the book reveals is that actually the model of the sort of mono-ethnic enclave of the idea, oh, this is a Chinese neighborhood, this is a Guyanese neighborhood, and so on, actually does not do justice to what's actually happening on the ground, which is much more, sort of interlocking and interpenetrating. So you have, both the existence of kind of UN buildings where there will be several dozen languages in a single building, as well as vertical villages where, villages are kind of reconstituted in a single building, although, there's always going to be, multiple languages in a building, basically. So, it's this kind of microcosm structure that there are reasons why people settle where they do. Of course, there's all kinds of factors of jobs and transit and so on, but language also plays a crucial role in why people go where they do. And of course, multilingualism, language mixing, the emergence of kind of new language mixing practices, is also pervasive. And yet, most of this is invisible in terms of, the census or in terms of what speakers of larger languages see or experience. So what are we talking about? What languages are we talking about? I think, an important case to look at in terms of all these factors is that of indigenous languages of Mexico, of which there are now several dozen that have come to New York. And this is because of the particular dynamics of the Mexican migration, which really crested in the 1990s and early 2000s, with something like 3/4 of all Mexican New Yorkers coming from a few states in southern Mexico, from Puebla and Guerrero especially. And this is a map of Mexico's linguistic diversity, several hundred indigenous languages spoken across Mexico, some with, significant numbers of speakers, despite the centuries of pressure from Spanish, but, very different dynamics to hear in some cases. And so you'll see that it's particularly the most linguistically diverse parts of Mexico that people are coming from. And according to one survey that was done, something like 3 times the number of Mexican New Yorkers speak indigenous languages versus in Mexico as a whole, because of the particular origins of where people are coming from. So in aggregate, we're talking about tens of thousands of speakers of Mixteco and Nahuatl and other languages that also from a linguistic point of view we're talking about languages that are seen perhaps as almost whole language families. So linguists will talk about Mixteco as Mixtecan, as a whole kind of language family on par with the Romance languages, the sort of dialectology and specifics of which have not even really been fully worked out, but really need to be sort of examined almost kind of community to community. There are differences in how people speak, and not, even clear whether we're talking about a dialect continuum or whether we're talking about, much more intricate patterns in region, which are then kind of transposed in complex ways to New York. Languages of Guatemala, where there are especially kind of Guatemalan New Yorkers coming from the Western Highlands, where Mayan languages are spoken, there's obviously such different situations in each place that people are coming from, and the colonial dynamics of language in country are also being carried over to here. So in places where there's already language shift to Spanish, that is also being carried over here. So language shame around language, sort of all the different kind of language attitudes as well are brought here as well, and in many cases end up, they can be exacerbated. In some cases they can be lessened, but people are often kind of settling with their kind of co-territorial or co-national group as well. So it's a continuity in some cases. The Garifuna community in New York, which is perhaps larger than almost anywhere else, represents a case of almost sort of triple diaspora. This is an Afro-Indigenous language that sort of forms on the island of St. Vincent, with enslaved Africans escaping and marrying into a local Arawakan Indigenous community, and then being sort of exiled by the British to the coast of Central America, essentially what's now Honduras and Belize and Guatemala. And then from there, in the sort of early mid-20th century, beginning to come up to especially Harlem, and then later the Bronx and Brooklyn, as well as a few other American cities, and having a language which has been shaped by each level of migration here, a language which is essentially an Arawakan language with reported African elements as well as then layers of English, Spanish, and French. And then, especially recently, but in the last few decades, a major migration from the Andes, and especially from South Central Ecuador to New York, where Quechua speakers of a variety of forms of Quechua, and again, Quechuan is from a linguistic point of view, a whole kind of language family, which sometimes people talk about it in terms of Peruvian Quechua and Ecuadorian Quechua and Bolivian Quechua, but actually the patterns are much more intricate than that. And so, people coming to New York from Azuay and Cañar, and now from Cotopaxi and particular places in Ecuador, speaking particular varieties of Quechua. This is just a sort of summation of then the particular neighborhoods that people are settling in, and the particular, the layers of identity that are then kind of in play as people are brought into a kind of pan Latino worlds or pan Mexican worlds, as well as kind of the attempt to overcome what's often isolation of indigenous language speaking individuals. To go to another part of the world, just to demonstrate again where people are coming from, what languages they're bringing, what are the patterns in recent decades. Nepal, a place with, from one linguistic count, something like 140 different languages, with very different sort of layers of language from different language families, depending on altitude, depending on where in the country. But Nepali New Yorkers are much more likely to come from the Himalayan zone, right up on the border with Tibet. This arrow points to one particular valley called Mustang, and that is, a place, we'll zoom in a second, but with something like 10,000 people, a historical kingdom, which was historically closer really to Tibet and is Tibetan Buddhist, but has been brought into the nation state of Nepal in the course of the last couple of centuries. So this is then a kind of a mapping of the Himalayan diaspora, especially kind of in and around Queens. which includes, languages from across this whole linguistic hotspot of the Himalaya. Is being driven by many factors, certainly, political factors in Tibet, in Nepal, climate factors as well, economic and other factors. And just even kind of zooming in back onto Mustang, this is a place with something like 10,000 population of just over 10,000 people, where half a dozen languages are spoken from somewhat different subgroups. And I just want to zoom in on a language called Seke, which is one of the focuses of Language City, and a language I've been working on for several years with Rasmina Gurung, who is one of the youngest speakers in her mid-20s. She's was born in Mustang, raised by her grandmother, which is often a sort of a crucial line of transmission when transmission is faltering. If you can sort of have skip a generation and be raised by a grandparent, that can make a real difference. Seke has an estimated something like 700 speakers, really coming from basically 5 villages in Mustang, in this part of northern Nepal. And today, this may even be an underestimate, something like a quarter to a third of these speakers, and especially all those kind of working age, really between their teens up into the 50s or 60s, a large portion have come to New York, and especially to a few buildings, mostly in Brooklyn, a few of these, what we call vertical villages. Rasmina in her mid-20s is one of the youngest speakers. And the multilingualism of the community is intense, and the pressure to shift languages has grown intense. Just want to show quickly the range of languages that people who speak Seke are kind of in contact with and drawn towards. So there is the immediately surrounding language, which is dominant in that part of Mustang, which is called Loke. There's Nepali as the national language. There's Tibetan as the language of Tibetan Buddhism and as a sort of culturally and historically significant language. And then increasingly there's English as well. This is a sort of a direct kind of local connection, more than transnational, translocal, between 2 very particular locales, a building in Brooklyn and a village in Mustang called Tsuksang. And this is a building where it's not only Seke speakers, but a whole range of Seke speakers from Tsuksang have come to. This is just a sort of a gathering in that building where actually the room has been transformed as the rooms of many Himalayan New Yorkers are. A living room also kind of doubles as a shrine room where the basic rituals of Tibetan Buddhism can also be followed. On July 4th in Prospect Park, something like a significant fraction, an 1/8, a 1/7 of the global population of Seke speakers gather for a picnic. This is the sort of the importance of these buildings and of New York and of cities in the in the fate of these languages. So what is a vertical village? How does this kind of structure play into the survival of a language? Again, urbanization often is seen as one of the driving factors of language endangerment, and as simply a negative factor that is adding all kinds of stress to speakers to switch to larger languages for economic reasons, among others. But vertical villages are one of the many kind of extraordinary measures that communities are able to take, despite all of the challenges, to try to stabilize a language, to also kind of find a foothold in a new land. It goes along with the whole galaxy of hometown associations, which in the Himalayan world are usually called kiduk, the Tibetan word that means joy and suffering or joy and sorrow, but also means a hometown association, which is a group of people from your particular home area who generally speak your language. And this is there are dozens of these just in the Himalayan community, and there are hometown associations are kind of fundamental bedrock, I would say, of the immigrant city, with different names in different languages, but a basic form of kind of mutual aid organization that so many communities have used, and in important spaces for language. So, in the case of a vertical village, certainly it's ultimately dependent on landlords and real estate, and it's not, the building is not owned by Seke speakers. But as Rasmina puts it, there is reliability and safety, because at the end of the day, if something goes wrong, your people are there. It's a space for the language, really unlike any other in the city. So in terms of our work over the years, together with Rasmina, the Endangered Language Alliance, and what it means to sort of do field work and to document a language like Seke, it fundamentally has to be multi-sited. It has to move between the two places, because the older speakers are still there. The Seke villages like Tsuksang are still a fundamental context for the language, where the plant and animal species are there. A lot of the historical and culturally significant sites are still there. But then the villages are largely empty, certainly of people in that whole age range. To some extent, people from neighboring groups are coming in and doing, working the land to some extent. And some, Seke speakers are able to return sometimes in the summer in certain cases. But there needs to be a kind of translocal field work to go along with the translocal linguistic situation. So what can you do well in a city, and what can you do well in situ, in the home region? This is a lot of what we kind of think about at the Endangered Language Alliance, and what we're trying to sort of model in terms of being a language organization in a city is to sort of work between New York and all of its kind of true sister cities around the world, the sister villages, sister valleys, places that are the sort of sending communities that New York is deeply connected to, places that most people have not heard of unless they're from those communities, perhaps like Mustang. So we've been trying to sort of find that way of working, where, as I described in the book, there have been sort of 2 periods of field work there, going back with Rasmina to interview the elders and those who were sort of left behind, as it were, to do the kind of work that you can only do in the village, but then to also kind of come back to the city and do what you can only do in a city or in New York, and the visibility that can be gained, as well as the kind of diasporic changes which are happening to the language as well. So this is some of the work, and this is language documentation, the idea of trying to obviously create recordings and a sort of transparent, hopefully permanent record of a language that is then, it includes often materials like a dictionary, a grammar, a corpus of recordings and representative texts in different genres from a wide variety of speakers that are then transcribed and translated, analyzed, made public, archived. This is a lot of work. Languages like Seke do not appear in any data set, are not found by the census. This is the US Census, a sort of basic form showing the one question on the American Community Survey about language. It's one question, basically. It says, does this person speak a language other than English at home? Yes or no. And then it gives a few examples, major national languages, for example, Korean, Italian, Spanish, Vietnamese. And what I would suggest is that for a number of reasons, we can't rely on any official data set to give us information about deep linguistic diversity. And this is what has then motivated our sort of own linguistic census, which we've been doing in New York and hope will be done elsewhere. Part of it is the languages that the census itself is offered in, right? That has expanded, but it's still a pretty small number of languages that you can even fill out the census in. Response rates are another issue. The lowest response rates are often in multilingual immigrant communities for various reasons, issues of trust, the politicization of the census that we've seen, especially in 2020, around the purported citizenship question, which was precisely meant to scare away immigrant communities from filling it out in many cases. The way this question is phrased, it's instructive to look at other censuses that are done in different countries. In Canada, where language is much more an issue at the forefront, there is quite a more detailed set of questions around language. Of course, there it's still primarily about sort of the Anglophone, Francophone divide and trying to sort of suss that out, as well as some questions that relate more to First Nations languages. But generally speaking, national censuses, which of course are the sort of gold standard for all kinds of data that is used in the social sciences, contain very little information that is truly, getting at linguistic diversity. Multilingualism, mixing, translanguaging, forget about it. If you write in multiple languages into that, into this box, what is this language? They actually have they discard anything but the first thing that you put in there. They're not able to handle sort of multilingual input in there. Yeah, certainly when you talk about other forms of language use that are what people are really doing kind of day to day, often on the streets of a city like New York, they're not captured by the census at all. And then there's how the data is tabulated as well for various reasons. It's, if you've ever seen how the data is then released by the Census Bureau, there are, these kind of composite categories, which are, from a linguistic point of view, almost useless, like American Indian and Native Alaskan. Some of it, there's justifications on a privacy level that, smaller languages, they don't want to sort of release the information in ways that people could be traced. So there's a sort of 10,000 person threshold for a language at the national level. But in any case, the way the data is tabulated, and even for languages, I mean, notoriously bad for African languages, even as those have become more and more present in New York, there have been these, these categories which have no kind of linguistic coherence to them. There was a category called Kru, Igbo, Yoruba, which grouped together three completely different African languages, not even from the same family, for reasons that were sort of unknown. But this became a large category with tens of thousands of speakers just in New York alone, and then led to maps being released and government agencies and others sort of speaking in terms of this Kru, Igbo, Yoruba community that was here or there that had no linguistic logic to it or coherence that either speakers or linguists would recognize. All of this has led to our attempt at the Endangered Language Alliance to do our own kind of linguistic census of New York. That grew out of realizing that languages like Seke, languages like Mixteco, languages that we were, where we had long-term partnerships working with communities, were not coming up at all on the census, were not reflected at all there. So our very first attempt was this Queens language map, Mother Tongues of Queens map, Queens being, for various reasons, the most linguistically diverse part in many ways of the most linguistically diverse city. This then expanded to a larger print map of the city and including some of the wider metropolitan area. And then now, most recently, invite you to check out languagemap.nyc, which is the digital interactive version of this, which we continue to update as much as we can. And this is where, as I said, over 700 language varieties that we've documented the presence of, mapped to over 1,200 significant sites. That includes religious institutions, as well as these hometown associations, restaurants, residential zones. And some of the things I mentioned earlier really have become evident or were lessons that came out of this process of mapping, which itself was based on thousands of conversations with speakers, community leaders, language activists. Again, the idea of putting a dot down on a space, and these are also fuzzed for privacy reasons, so it's not, you don't see exactly like, okay, you can go to this door, knock on this door and speak a language, but there are patterns, there are structures. Linguistic diversity is not kind of randomly distributed. Here you see a sort of color coding by region of the world that the language originates in, but the map provides all kinds of other ways to search and filter and understand the data and to look at what's going on beyond the largest languages. We also provide a tab with the census data, the latest data from the American Community Survey, which has its uses for the very largest couple of dozen languages, I would say, at least at a generalized level. Although certain things will be completely missed, like Jamaican patois, for instance, which for various reasons, only a fraction of Jamaican patois speakers will kind of talk about it as a separate language or list it as a separate language. So, that would not be captured. But in any case, this also allows you to compare the census data and the ELA data that came about through our linguistic census. So I think it begins to sort of suggest a kind of a deep linguistic geography for the city. And we also have made, the code is completely open source, and we've seen now people in other cities trying to kind of do the same thing, working with the same code to create language maps in Berlin, Nairobi, Los Angeles. So, this is just sort of zooming in on what these microcosms look like that emerge, I think. And, post-Soviet Brooklyn, where it may be associated as a Russian-speaking neighborhood, but Russian really is a lingua franca for a whole set of communities coming from across the former Soviet Union, speaking languages of Central Asia, the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, as well as a variety of languages of the Jewish diaspora that it intersects with. But at the same time, large numbers of speakers of Spanish and Urdu and other languages as well. And likewise with the worlds of West Harlem, West African Harlem and the Bronx, or the indigenous South Bronx as well, that there are patterns, and there will be a lingua franca and sort of a double or triple embedding of smaller linguistic communities, which is precisely what renders them kind of invisible to outsiders. But often we've found that ultimately the visibility is something that many communities want. And we have not had any, in all of those discussions, we've not had any communities say don't list us or don't show us, but that actually the very fact of being sort of represented in some way on a map that policymakers, city agencies, nonprofits, and other organizations can use and then sort of advocate around is something that people want. Himalayan Jackson Heights. So kind of wanting to leave a lot of time for questions and a real just discussion about whatever is interesting to you guys. Just want to say a little bit about where we stand now and the future of the most linguistically diverse city. Language endangerment is accelerating everywhere. It's become a global phenomenon, such that people are increasingly already having shifted languages, and sometimes through kind of multi-stop migration processes where it's not directly necessarily from a village to a vertical village. It's via multiple cities through a whole process. So language loss already kind of starting back home, shift being kind of already in progress, and sometimes just being sort of completed when people arrive here. The whole digital realm, we could have a whole set of discussions about this. Where are the virtual villages to go with the vertical villages? As I said, something like 5% of the world's languages online, according to one estimate of this, having ascended online. And what does it mean for the others? It's some hope now that with AI or AR or VR, there will be ways for even languages with relatively few hours of parallel text, few hours of recordings to be used in these technologies. I mean, that's part of the connection here, is that generally speaking, to create the language technologies, you need enough material. There needs to be enough documentation for the models to be trained. There are various tech companies that come to us and are interested in sort of sucking up the data that we're collecting and building, but that raises all kinds of questions, obviously. So what is it? Yeah, we won't get too deep into the technological question yet, but I'm sure we'll get there at some point. And the question of how languages are then being used, we're have been talking and thinking in terms of languages as everyday practices, vernaculars, but increasingly there is a sort of a discussion and shift to talking about post-vernacularity and more symbolic and performative uses of languages, where there may be a desire to retain a language in certain spheres or for certain uses, but it may not be any longer as a kind of daily practice or daily vernacular. I use this term linguistic infrastructure. We're sort of starting to see kind of some things being put in place at the city level or at the state level to try to increase language access, or to try to, have make sure that different government agencies have at least some kind of language access plan, or language coordinators. But will there be enough of this kind of in place to really make any difference in terms of language maintenance in the city or in terms of the city's kind of multilingual fabric? Changes to the city itself, and gentrification, the rising costs of city life. On the other side of the coin, the diversification of suburbs and of smaller cities and of cities elsewhere that people are sort of passing from New York or other larger cities into. So, what does this look like from a more suburban picture or in smaller cities? And then obviously a whole set of questions around unequal mobilities and, the role of immigration policy. The city has fundamentally depended on this kind of role, this historic role, I would argue, as a kind of membrane between worlds and as a gateway for immigration. And obviously we're currently in a moment between the so-called migrant crisis, the election, immigration having sort of become a fundamental, political issue of the moment, just as in 1924, that could leave this moment looking like peak diversity potentially. So I maybe just want to briefly kind of then introduce how the Endangered Language Alliance is a response to this. And basically the way that the book Language City is structured is around a kind of the story of this organization, which originates in 2010 as a kind of eccentric extended family of linguists, language activists, speakers, ordinary New Yorkers. The only kind of organization that we know of that's focused on urban linguistic diversity. That's one piece of the book. The other is this linguistic history of the city. How did this come to be? What does this look like? And then there are these portraits of 6 speakers of different languages from different parts of the world and what they're doing with their languages. So that's how the book kind of unfolds. But in terms of this organization, which has been the sort of channel for so much of the work that I'm talking about, the work includes both, core sort of language documentation. This shows the sort of building of a language database in this piece of software called FieldWorks Language Explorer, which interestingly was created by an organization called the Summer Institute of Linguistics, which also created Ethnologue, which is ultimately a missionary organization. And it's kind of important to note that, yes, linguists and language activists are doing more and more language documentation, especially in the last few decades. But missionaries in pursuit of Bible translation have perhaps been doing even more on a kind of volume basis, as well as creating tools like Ethnologue or like Flex, as it's called, that are used for these purposes. So, there are interesting implications there. This story is kind of cannot be completely divorced from global evangelization patterns that are happening. But documentation of that kind of traditional linguistic academic nature is certainly a big part of what we do and can do, as I talked about with Seke here in New York or between New York and home communities. Archiving as well, there's been a whole kind of a tremendous change and rise of kind of new digital language archives in the last couple of decades. So ours is a kind of sub-repository of the Internet Archive, archive.org, which is this kind of now kind of classic digital archive online, but there are a lot of custom-built archives as well. The Endangered Language Archive called ELAR, based in Berlin. One called ILA, focused on indigenous languages of the Americas at the University of Texas. The Native California languages archived in Berkeley. So, a huge amount of material has been sort of coming online that linguists and others are depositing, which I think still to some extent very few people have really kind of been able to really work with and analyze. And it's not always easy to work with, but at least is providing the potential and feeding a kind of new golden age of language revitalization, which is also happening. And I remember hearing the director of the archive in Berkeley saying that initially when they set it up, most people who consulted it were linguists, and now the majority of people are actually native language activists from California who are seeking to revitalize their languages. So, some of our work is of a more, academic nature, but some is much more public facing. So events that bring languages kind of onto the stage and into kind of public events that, have of a nature that haven't really happened before. So these are some stills from a series called Unheard Of, where, one event featured speakers and musicians working in lesser known languages of Indonesia, another one with languages of the Pamir Mountains in Tajikistan. Sorry. Hosting classes in languages that are not commonly taught, that are not taught usually in universities, being essentially a hub for kind of community language teaching in a variety of languages. Publishing and literacy activities. So linguists, we're often being sort of called into now, help with the creation of practical orthographies, as they're called, writing systems that people, language activists, kind of need or want in order to create materials. In this case, things like children's books, some of which we've published. Children's books are often a huge focus, understandably, given the centrality of intergenerational transmission. And of course, again, there's not going to be a commercial, as with the technology stuff, there's not really going to be necessarily enough of a market for anybody to be creating these materials, but to find economical ways to self-publish and create materials that, a language for which there had not been children's books before, as in generally the case of these Pamiri languages of Tajikistan. This is 6 different languages from that region. And, each decision is a complex one, like whether you're sort of standardizing by writing in a particular way, using in this case both a Latin and a Cyrillic-based orthography, because these are sort of cross-border communities where the existing familiarity might be with a Cyrillic system, might be with a Latin-based system. What kinds of illustrations, how they're going to show the language, what variety is going to be chosen from which town or village that will be maximally understandable to people. This was an event we had here in the city with Pamiri kids and Pamiri parents, kind of debuting these books. Another major piece of what we do with the Endangered Language Alliance increasingly is around language access and advocacy and work with city agencies. There is a new kind of movement to form, and even some city support for Indigenous interpreters co-ops for language translation, born out of issues and questions around the sort of language services industry and these major companies like Language Line and SOS, which are able to get the big RFPs now that there are kind of, some rules or laws stipulating that there needs to be interpretation. There has emerged a new kind of industry around language, which works in particular ways, as a number of the companies are based here in New York, but of course will sort of source their interpreters wherever is least expensive through virtual means. And in some sense, there's now a response to say that actually interpretation and translation should be operating at a more local level. I want to close perhaps by talking about the situation during the height of COVID in 2020, where we saw that, at this moment in March and April 2020, where New York was the epicenter. The epicenter of the epicenter was in multilingual immigrant neighborhoods, especially in places like Queens, Jackson Heights, and Corona. And by kind of mapping COVID case data onto the language map, we could see that for a variety of reasons, certainly connected to, many people being essential workers, connected to overcrowded housing, but also connected to language. Many of these communities and many of the people we were working with were kind of in the center of things. And, it was a time when these issues of translation, interpretation, and language access were came directly to the fore, because if you heard about something that was happening and, some public health guidance 1 or 2 days later, or even a week later, or if the information was never communicated in your language, then this could be a matter of life or death, not to mention the situation once you are within a hospital. For many communities, I mean, the burden of translation is taken up by people themselves. You bring a relative along, some younger relative, somebody like Rasmina often does this for her community. But during the height of COVID, you couldn't do that. You couldn't actually bring another person into the hospital. So people were really on their own. And that's kind of in one example of something. There was a huge response. We kind of shelved for the time being a lot of the more documentation work, any kind of grammatical descriptions, all kind of went on hold to support the recording of PSAs about COVID in a variety of languages, to support a whole range of mutual aid efforts and the creation of diaries and oral histories, kind of talking about what was happening in different linguistic communities around the city during this time. The connections between language and health, we had just started to explore through a project with the Department of Health a few years earlier. Then this kind of took it to the next level. The Department of Health, one staffer in particular who was passionate about this and herself half Zapotec from Mexico, had realized that many of the most vulnerable New Yorkers in terms of health measures were these indigenous language speakers, who also are heavily represented in the occupational niche of deliveristas, delivering food, who've been organizing increasingly in the last couple of years as well. So as a result of this, the Department of Health commissioned us to do a study of these communities, bringing together all the speakers that we'd been working with on language projects to then do a whole series of interviews in 6 different indigenous languages of Latin America about language and health and a variety of related issues. And then during COVID, this kind of came to a head and was actually having to be applied. But I guess the sort of positive side to mention is that as a result of this kind of big belated reaction, there were probably more messages made in more languages about COVID than have ever been made about any topic in the history of the world. Leaving aside maybe the missionary translations of the Book of Genesis and parts of the Bible, but you saw just a huge set of efforts worldwide with linguists and language activists and communities and public health officials recording messages in languages that had never before had a public health message, and grappling with all those issues of terminology and translation and dissemination, focusing on audio and video translation as well, because that is what works better for oral languages, right? And so whether that proves to be a model for future public health crises or language access initiatives in general remains to be seen, but it did provide a kind of glimpse of what this might look like, even if so much of it was driven ultimately by community organizations and speakers themselves, and not really from the government level, but except belatedly. So the fuller story is in Language City, I really look forward to kind of hearing your questions and talking about it. It's as I said, both a kind of linguistic history of the city and an account of this strange organization, the Endangered Language Alliance, which I also invite you to come kind of to our events and check out what we're doing, as well as then a series of portraits that hopefully bring this alive through the lives of individual speakers and give you a sense of actually what it's like in, homes and streets in, especially in Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx. So I think maybe that's a place to stop and to kind of go into just a conversation, questions, but thank you for listening. Yeah, Howard.
Talk a little bit about the relationship between about the Endangered Language Alliance with the city administration. What about the relationship between the Alliance and the K-12 system? Do you have any connection there?
Yeah, that's a good question. We, at one point were contacted by the Department of Health and have had some discussions with them. I didn't even sort of talk about as part of this question of linguistic infrastructure, the whole world of bilingual education, which I'm sure so many of you are connected to. And now, that there are programs in 13 different languages and, of very different size and nature. But, we've done programs at some individual schools around New York. There's one school called the iSchool downtown, which we had a consistent program with over several years where they had a kind of class tailored around our work. And I would go there every year. They would come to us. We would sometimes take them out to Queens. But I would say that, there hasn't been that much aside from that. And at one point in those discussions with the Department of Education, they showed us their data about the languages that they get through that intake survey that they do. And then they also kind of which was perhaps better data in some ways than any other city agency has, and a little bit better than the census. But still a lot of kind of confusion about many of especially that sort of long tail of languages, the smaller languages, about what, there would be 5 different names that were all kind of referring to Fujianese, for instance, that people, might have been what was reported, what people said, but it wasn't, necessarily clear to them what they were sort of dealing with. So yeah, I mean, from our side, we know much less than we would like to know. Perhaps I feel like people in this room could actually help bridge this gap. So it's, I think, there's obviously an extraordinary range of languages that kids are bringing into the schools. I think still the way that data is collected is often pretty limited in terms of even knowing what people are bringing to the schools. And then what happens as those languages are brought in is, I'm not sure. So, yeah.
I can jump in.
Yeah.
The same question. And those of us who work with people who will be teaching in the schools, that's quite a few of us here. One of the things that happens, this is such a baby step and so important, is that teachers, administrators don't even know that language diversity exists. So it's basically like, okay, people speak Spanish, to put it, not quite that extreme. But then you get a teacher who says, oh, I have this one child and I don't know what's happening. And it turns out that one child speaks one specific language. And I'm just wondering about that level of education. It's pretty basic, but would be a really fundamentally powerful thing to offer in the school system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think we started to, when we met with some of the language access coordinators and people who were involved in that work at the DOE, that I think that was part of the idea, was that we could go give sort of this versions of this talk or more tailored versions. I remember there was a school in East Harlem, for instance, that had come up in a few different ways that, was seen to have a large, portion of Spanish speakers, certainly, but also, and a number of other languages, but that we knew from the people we were working with in East Harlem, and that one teacher there also came to understand that there were several dozen who were from Mixteco speaking backgrounds as well. And then a number of them were just put into some kind of speech pathology, or it was seen that they were actually, linguistically deficient, and they were just being sort of put there. Maybe they were being pushed towards Spanish. In some cases, the parents actually are learning Spanish in New York because the places that people are coming from in Mexico were actually indigenous language dominant, where people, it raises the question of are people between languages in some ways. So these situations, then what happens once they're kind of seen as, like a deficit model, that they're somehow lacking something when actually there is an indigenous language that's present, or there's a shift that's ongoing. It's such a complex set of issues. And to from what I understood, also having like a principal who really gets it and understands, and what do you do if it's, in that case, it was like, there was a potential because it was a whole group, but if it's individual students, to even identify them, yeah.
So a related question, and then I'll stop, because I'm sure other people have questions, and I have so many. I'm also thinking about, for instance, there's a network of international high schools that you might be familiar with, where all of the students are relatively recent arrivals. And the thing I'm wondering is if you could talk a little bit about what it's like as far as you know, to be a person who's working with you about their own language? Like, what is that process like for some of the people you work with? I'm imagining some of the students who we work with and what that might look like for them.
Yeah, occasionally there has been a student who has been connected to us that we've then tried to do some amount of work with. Usually they're a little bit older than that, but yeah, it's something that I try to describe in Language City, but it's often a kind of a process of a big sort of mutual opening up, because often, you know, a lot of our projects start from people coming to us and, you know, community leaders or speakers or people saying, oh, I have a grandparent who speaks this, or oh, I speak a little of this, or we want to do something. But in a lot of cases, there's also a connection with somebody who kind of doesn't even realize necessarily that what they speak is, you know, is a language or is an endangered language, or it's like that anybody outside would be interested in it. It's something that maybe is kind of an in-group badge, but has not been seen by them as a whole linguistic system. And again, with it being primarily oral too, when we sort of, even in our initial stages, maybe we, depending on the project, will be using the International Phonetic Alphabet and showing that, you know, oh, this has a logic, this has a system, oh, has regularity. We'll look up and have access to any of the relevant linguistic research and say, oh, well, there was this paper from 1964. You know, it's like, oh, and it's about your, you know, variety that you speak. And find whatever materials might exist in archives, or connect with linguists in other, you know, in other places who have knowledge, or look at the wider language family. It's often this feeling of like, wow, I speak something that is actually real. It's connected to the whole world. It's a system. It's not just a sort of informal code that we speak among us in our small world. And so on the one hand, that can be a sort of revelation, just as it's a revelation for us to learn from the speaker and to sort of the world that they're opening up through the language. You know, but then it's always a question of, well, what is that? What do you do next? And how do you go from there? And what are the opportunities? I mean, we run on a shoestring. Whatever money we have, we generally are using to pay speakers for their time, but it's not going to be enough to sort of create jobs for people. I mean, still people are like, wow, I'm getting paid to document my language or to do something with my language, but it's you know, sometimes there are situations where we're able to connect, and there are, you know, connect a speaker to a wider community of speakers, or make some kind of you know, more kind of long-term difference. But yeah, often people have to kind of are sort of excavating the language themselves as they work on it. You know, sort of to sort of maintain it more broadly is also to sort of maintain it in themselves and to try to find a context for it. So there can be a lot of excitement about the ability to use a language in New York, to showcase it, to show people through social media, to show people sort of back in the home region, to make all those connections, can be really exciting. But like, what is the longer game? How do you make this a sort of a sustainable activity is something that I think we're still struggling with.
Thank you.
Thank you, Russ. Fascinating work, and I'm sure as time goes by, your work becomes increasingly more important. Probably because we are entering a new era in the way that we understand the role of language in the fabric of society. My question particularly focuses on kind of linguistic diversity, and that is, for example, the English spoken by non-native speakers of English, and myself, a prime example of that. And I subscribe to the idea that proposed by Chomsky, that language primarily is not the means of communication. It is a tool for making thoughts, forming ideas, and through speech or writing is secondary to that. So also the message that I get from your work is that the essence of documentation of the languages and preserving the linguistic diversity is to preserve the human wisdom, and experience, and the beauty that we create through these languages, right? Now, keeping that in mind, working in academia, good luck with writing your essays using your first language discourse system. Good luck with publishing a book here in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, right? not following the norms that has dominated this tradition of discourse building, right? Just look at the work of Heidegger or Descartes, good luck with understanding, so much obscurity, but the nature of that discourse in that language, right? And now we expect that discourse, the way that the native speakers of English write in academia, any deviation from that is facing dismissal, rejection, dismissal of idea, right? And now here, as the elites of the society, we want to promote that diversity, but in reality, actually, whoever has that diversity is going to be dismissed, right? And this is so dishonest, I think, among the elite society that adheres to the rules of the Anglo-Saxon tradition of writing, right? And then claiming diversity. And now here, the generative AI will get to a point that it can create discourse comparable to the human discourse. For example, following the tradition here. And if I can use AI to write something not to be dismissed because of the way that I wrote, and if I'm going to be dismissed, I should be dismissed because of the veracity of my ideas. Why not using that? In the short term, it is going to bring about some equity in the society, at least at this level that we are functioning. In the long term, it is going to kill all this diversity. But AI is not going to kill the diversity. You are killing the diversity by not appreciating, by not valuing. I mean, on the surface, we can talk about it, toss out all these buzzwords, but when it comes to practice, good luck with a child who is writing in a school and trying to graduate, and good luck with the graduate students here in Columbia community writing their final papers using a Chinese or Persian or Arabic way of building discourse. I just want to hear your insights on all the things that I said, if I made sense.
No, thank you, Payman. There's so many things there. The fundamental role of orality that you mentioned is a kind of core tenet of any kind of linguistics that I know of, and certainly it's at the core of what everything we're talking about here. That writing, we really have to sort of put reading, writing, and literacy in their proper place historically, which is as a very particular derivative recent technology, mostly connected to states, empires, scholarly elites, which are usually connected with political elites historically, maybe some commercial elites, and that these things emerge as Ibrahima in the book, who is the promoter of UNCO, this a relatively new West African system, writing system that was pioneered in the 1940s to unite the Manding languages of West Africa. Ibrahima talks about writing emerging, if history is a day, writing emerges in the evening and spoken language, in the morning. There's still a lot of controversies and questions over the history of spoken language, but this is something which clearly goes back, spoken and signed language, and we haven't spoken as much about signed languages, but something like 200 sign languages around the world, most of them highly endangered, many of the same questions applying, and perhaps even more forcefully that we spoke about with spoken languages. Spoken and signed language, these are deep features of every human group that has been found. They are fundamental behaviors whose origins we can barely even glimpse. Whereas writing is something that emerges in a very few particular places, sort of beginning 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, and then really only becoming sort of very widespread and kind of mandated very recently. And formal education systems such as that of which we're a part here as playing a crucial role in that. So if there is a way to fundamentally flip the way we are valuing these things, that would be ideal. But the fact is that there is a deep prejudice of the literate against the non-literate, and against the oral, and even an appreciation or an understanding of orality and of the oral arts and of oral literature and of oral tradition is something that we only can sort of gesture towards, I think, if we're, I don't believe in the absoluteness of that divide. There's been a lot of kind of scholarly questions and controversies over like how absolute is that divide? Once you move from morality to literacy, is there a fundamental kind of change in your mind, in your whole kind of cognitive functioning? I don't know about that. There's a lot of interesting questions there. There's also a lot of complex relationships to literacy where there can be sort of knowledge of literacy, partial literacy in a larger language while maintaining orality in a mother tongue. But fundamentally, I think we need an approach that puts orality kind of deeply at the center. Different technologies do that to different degrees. And I think that's part of the question about technology is are there technologies that can be more oral centered? And I talk about the use of voice messages, for instance, among Seke speakers, and how that's a way to bypass these vexed questions of literacy that force certain issues. At the same time, we have to recognize that many language activists today, like Ibrahima, are really embracing literacy and are trying to sort of carry their languages over into the literate realm and develop the whole suite of tools that go with literacy and the whole set of affordances which literacy does have for this kind of society that we live in. And so we do support those efforts. There are some language activists who do kind of try to maintain an oral centered approach, but I would say that there are many more who want literacy to be part of the solution and want to design these children's books and language materials and so on. So supporting that and bringing as many languages sort of into that as possible where it's wanted is still kind of crucial to our work. But especially when it comes to academic work and the work inside universities, I think what you say is true, and that we're not even aware of how exclusionary that our discourses are, and that the formation of new meta languages and terminologies and theories that are sort of spun out of the dominant languages are not actually are doing the opposite of what they claim to do in many cases. So it's such a complex set of issues. Thank you for those words, and let's continue that conversation.
Hi, I'm from India originally, and English is pretty much my thinking language. However, my mother tongue is Marathi, and I still speak it. I spoke it to our daughter when she was growing up. I speak Marathi and Hindi as well, and read and write. So what is involved in being a translator for these languages?
So I do some work as a translator as well. I've worked from Chinese and from Yiddish into English in different ways. I'm not a great specialist of translation studies, right? This is a whole kind of world unto itself with so many questions and intricacies. And also, speaking of the oral literate divide, right, there's also this kind of interpretation translation divide where interpretation is associated with the oral, the simultaneous translation is associated with the written and the non-simultaneous. I think that, however, a lot of the work we do involves translation at a deep level. Whenever I'm talking about dictionaries here, I'm talking about bilingual or trilingual dictionaries, not monolingual dictionaries. There is almost always transcription and translation in these corpora of text that we're creating. Is always into the sort of a language of wider communication. So translation is something often under theorized that linguists are always doing, often really focused on literal translation that sort of shows linguistic structure. So that's quite a different kind of translation from, when I talk about indigenous interpreters co-ops, those are really all about, situations in courts and hospitals where, people are trying to solve a particular problem in real time. But what I think we do need to acknowledge is, that there are sort of different levels of translational difficulty depending on what languages are involved. And when you're working with related languages, within a sort of a language family or within a tradition that have sort of grown up together. This is why Edward Sapir spoke of standard average European, was actually to say that a number of European languages, there was a sort of fundamental kind of translatability between them because they had, for a combination of reasons, sort of grown up together importing their technical meta language from Greek and Latin, for instance, but also kind of sharing with each other at various times, that there was a degree of translatability. And people have noted this also about, for instance, Korean and Japanese, that even though they're from different language families, that there is a certain kind of ability to translate fairly directly in sort of line by line ways because of the ways that the languages have been in contact over time, and that they're typologically, their features have kind of grown together through language contact. So, when that doesn't hold, when you're translating across sort of significant, different families, different linguistic areas, different structural types, as well as very different situations in terms of orality, literacy, standardization, all of these factors, and not even to mention sort of directionality of translation, which, traditionally there's just the directionality of translation is always a kind of power directionality towards the powerful language, essentially. It's, there are significant gaps and differences and difficulties that open up, and I think particular issues that need to be accounted for, where I don't know to what extent it would be the case for Marathi English, but I would see that, I guess the fundamental question here is that the world is not simply, a thing on a set of things on which we hang different labels in different languages, but there are, and this gets into sort of all kinds of interesting linguistic controversies, but there are languages divide up the world in different ways. Even partonomies of the body, as they're called, right? We take for granted, perhaps as English speakers, the arm and the hand, that these are somehow two distinct, clearly differentiated entities, whereas many languages have a word for arm hand, and don't see this as there being some sort of fundamental kind of division here or partonomy. But think about that in so many other ways, and think about that in terms of abstract conceptions as well, that we have different ways of dividing up the world. Now, of course, through multilingualism, we have ways of crossing these boundaries. We're often asked for untranslatable words, and there's a sort of romance of untranslatability, which I don't generally really accept or point to. I usually try to challenge it and say, no, it might take a whole book to translate something. It might be, how long do you have? But there are different ways and means of translation depending on who's asking in what situations and what is being looked for. But we have to start by acknowledging deep linguistic difference. I think that the focus on linguistic universals, on the one hand, sort of the romance of untranslatability, and then on the other hand, the sort of focus on linguistic universals and the idea that we all speak dialects of Earthling. I think these two extreme positions have not served us, and that actually we need to find the dynamics and ethics of translation as the art that it is, and of course now one that is increasingly tied up with issues of technology and AI as well. So that's the beginning of an answer, but I it's a giant question.
Thank you. So the work that you're doing, the work that you're doing currently, the preserving mother tongues. So that the first step is, of course, getting people to speak in their mother tongue and preserving it. It's also a comfort level for people. There's one more thing that I've been concerned about lately, and that is basically the loss of medicinal properties in foods, which come through language. It's about the medicinal quality of food, it's the food combinations, etc. And from my own growing up in India, I come from a Telugu speaking family. And so my grandmother used to have a lot of little sayings. They would kind of rhyme. And it would be something like, you eat jackfruit on an empty stomach, but mango on a full stomach. Eat peanuts with jaggery. And I think this is universal, because even in Arabic, you have dates with tahini in the winter, dates with yogurt in the summer. So we are losing a lot of that. And again, my parents passed on a few, and my sister, who's 9 years younger, doesn't know many of them. So, and I've been talking to Italians, they're experiencing the same thing. So I would like to see some of that being recorded and preserved, because they have a lot of usefulness, right, for good health.
Thank you for that. So one of the people whose portrait I paint in the book is Irwin, this Nahuatl speaking chef from Puebla in Mexico, who kind of cooks with these ideas in mind, cooks with Nahuatl words in mind. The foundations of Mexican cuisine are in Nahuatl, words like taco and mole and guacamole and chocolate and tomato and all these words that are fundamental are Nahuatl words that he's trying to sort of recover their actual meaning. And he notes, and others have noted, and this came up in our work with the Department of Health, that often people's diets really decline when they come here and when they lose their language. And I think it's for some of the reasons that you mentioned, which is that, I mean, we put this kind of general label of traditional knowledge kind of on top of all of this, but we're talking about, deep fundamental knowledge of things that are essential for life, including food and health. And, there may be access to, surgery and certain modern medicine, which is obviously, which is crucial as well, and people want as well. But the loss of knowledge about food and health that comes through language is essential. And not to mention that food is obviously a great way into language. It provides a real, I think also kind of key sort of metaphors and ideas as well, because we have, ingredients that have often kind of moved across continents and gone through, such complex kind of patterns, but then articulated very locally through recipes that are passed down in families and in particular villages and locales. So there is a sort of combination of kind of universalism and localism. And then I would maybe further make a comparison that national cuisines are kind of like national languages, these cuisines that are now sort of packaged up, and we think, I'm going to go to a Mexican restaurant, to a Nepali restaurant. This is how these things are listed on Google Maps and Yelp and these things. The national cuisine is itself a kind of, it's obviously an artifact of nationalism, but it kind of has a standardization in it and a simplification that I think, like national language, it has its uses, but it obscures both the much wider connections, the fact that tomatoes are not Italian, but actually a Nahuatl word, which is not to say that something belongs in one place or another. These things have spread in various ways. There's all kinds of interesting conversations to have about, food sovereignty and where foods originate and where they go. But both, I think those widespread patterns and those deeply local in particular patterns are actually much more interesting and fundamental than these kind of, the sort of the new national cuisines, not to mention all of the sort of destructive nature of a lot of contemporary food processes. So thank you for that. I think the connections between food and health are multifarious. Yeah.
I actually have a question from a member of our online audience. Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. It reads, thank you for an interesting description of the problem. But what are some solutions to removing these languages from the endangered list? Catalan is a good example of a language that is no longer endangered. Basque is coming back due to intense efforts of the Basque Parliament. I live in Sicily now, and Sicilian is in great danger. There is considerable shame about speaking Sicilian by educated speakers of Italian. It is frowned upon for children to speak Sicilian. Sicilian is not taught in most places. I'm new here, but the situation is shocking. What are best practices for moving beyond description to resolution?
My neighbors in Queens are a 4th-generation Sicilian-speaking family, so there is also Sicilian is in some ways strong in New York, but certainly faces some of the same pressures. Yes, I only kind of talked briefly about this idea of a golden age of language revitalization, which is perhaps has been starting. There are now hundreds of programs and initiatives and situations in different places that point to ways to maintain and revitalize languages, some of them being tried in urban contexts, and a wealth of case studies, including, Catalan, Basque, Hawaiian, Maori, Welsh, Sami, famously in, a number of examples from Native American languages, including Wampanoag in Massachusetts, Maya-Mia in Ohio. So there are a range of different ways of doing this, where Hawaiian language revivalists have stressed the education system and building an education system from the ground up in Hawaiian. Advocates for native languages in California have focused on master apprentice programs, which maybe apply more where there are just a small number of speakers and you pair an elder with a younger learner for multiple years of often sort of traditional activities, but in language work together. And even the creation of a single new native speaker is considered to be a huge achievement. So there's a range of efforts. I mean, the Maori approach famously is the kohangareo, which is these kind of language nests focused also in the Hawaiian case too, but focused on kind of the, earliest 3-year-olds, preschool immersion. So there are a lot of different models for language revitalization. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on. But I think, there are still a lot of unanswered questions. And one of the ones that I try to talk about in the book, and I think kind of, raises the most controversy is to what extent this depends on other forms of sovereignty, whether it's connected to ultimately political and economic sovereignty, and that if you don't have a sort of space ultimately for a language, what does that mean? A place, a set of contexts, a certain amount of self-determination, cultural and linguistic self-determination. Will these strategies really work ultimately? So yeah, there are a number of approaches to this, and I think we're just starting to kind of see a lot of efforts. I mean, some of them reflect, like the Wampanoag case. This is a language that was not spoken for a century and a half that has now been brought back, and in some ways kind of it represents almost a new stage of the language in certain ways. And that's very different from a case like Catalan, where there was continuous numbers of speakers. So there's a huge range of strategies. I hope that provides a few of them, and there's a growing literature on language revitalization, and some of our projects do have some of that piece in mind. I mean, I should also say that this is an area where linguists often, even linguists from the relevant communities, I think these things are ultimately very much up to a community, their personal choices as well. They're the choices about what language is actually going to be used in the home. Linguists are better placed in most situations to help with these things like documentation, practical orthography. Here are the materials, here are the tools, but not to get too wrapped up, I think, in community language decisions.
We actually need to wrap up this portion of the evening, but we can continue this conversation over dinner. And thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
again.
everyone. Yeah, it was concerning.